It gladdens me to know that Odin prepares for a feast. This hero that comes into Valhalla does not lament his death. I shall not enter Odin's hall with fear. My death comes without apology, and I welcome the Valkyries to summon me home.
The Viking Advance. Chapter 1.
They came out of the cold and hostile north on a June day in 793 AD. Long, low, black ships with tall, curving prows and broad red and white sails, dancing over the waves towards the English island of Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria. The ships plunged straight onto the beach, and out poured a band of huge, shaggy men howling like animals and waving swords. In an instant, they swarmed up the island's grassy slopes, where herds of fat sheep and cattle grazed peacefully in the meadows, ready for slaughtering. But Lindisfarne had far greater attractions for the invaders than fresh provisions. On the island stood a venerable Christian monastery, to which generations of both the pious and the wicked had bequeathed riches for repose of their souls. In its chapels and on its altars lay a profusion of golden crucifixes, silver pyxes and ciboria, ivory reliquaries, precious tapestries woven of silk and linen, and books of illuminated vellum encrusted with precious stones. To the monks surrounded by these riches, the monastery at Lindisfarne was far more than a repository of worldly wealth. It was the center of learning and a sanctuary for contemplation. The monks spent their days praying, chanting orisons, inscribing manuscripts, corresponding with fellow monks throughout Christendom, and chronicling the events of their times. On the entire island there was not a single armed man, and it was quite unthinkable that any God-fearing soul would dare lay unlawful hands on the monks' property. The intruders from the sea, however, had no reverence for the Christian God, no scruples about plundering a Christian sanctuary, and scant regard for human life in general. They fell with their swords upon the monks. Some of the brothers were cut down and killed in front of their altars. Others were thrown into the sea to drown, and some were stripped naked and driven out of the monastery to the hoots and jeers of these invaders. The sacred buildings were denuded of their gold and silver, the illuminated manuscripts and jewels, and the treasure was carried down to the beach. There the raiders loaded their waiting ships. Long before an alarm could be sent out, these vessels, now heavy with booty, had vanished over the dark gray waters of the North Sea whence they had come. This was an atrocity unprecedented in the memory of living man, and the terrible news flew as fast as messengers on foot, on horseback, and on shipboard could take it throughout the scattered Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and beyond. Before long, the news had crossed the English Channel to the land of the Franks, where Alcuin, another Anglo-Saxon monk and ranking scholar of the age, was supervising a renaissance of learning at the court of Emperor Charlemagne at Aachen. Alcuin, expressing the shock and dismay of his fellow believers throughout Christendom, wrote, "It is nearly 350 years that we and our fathers have inhabited in this most lovely land, and never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as the one we have just suffered from a pagan race." To Alcuin and his contemporaries, the desecration of the monastery was not only appalling, it was simply astounding. In a day when sailors were not known to venture out of the sight of land, that such an inroad from the sea could even be made. Alcuin could little guess at the terrors yet to rise out of the sea in his lifetime, and for many lifetimes to come. Terrors that would make Lindisfarne seem no more than a minor act of vandalism. The pagan people to whom he referred were the Norsemen, with whom British and European merchants already had a nodding acquaintance as traders. Soon these raiders would be known throughout Christendom as the Vikings, and viewed as a scourge to the civilized world. Many, like Alcuin, saw in the Vikings' riot of death and destruction a fulfillment of the words of the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah. Out of the north evil shall break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land. Indeed, the day of judgment might well be at hand. The summer after the raid on Lindisfarne, the Vikings descended upon Jarrow, about 50 miles down the Northumbrian coast, and struck a blow at the monastery that once was the residence of the Venerable Bede, perhaps the greatest historian, theologian, and astronomer of his time. In the summer of 795, the Vikings ravaged the coast of Scotland, and the coast of Wales. In 797, it was the turn of the Isle of Man, and in 800, a monastery just south of Jarrow, and another, more distant, on the west coast of Scotland. Before long, it was said that monastery chapels and village churches of England rang with a new prayer. From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord. And still the Northmen came. These swift hit-and-run summertime raids at the close of the 8th century were just preliminary stirrings of what was to become an epic movement lasting nearly 300 years. From about 800 onward, the Vikings swept south, west, and east as if borne on a tidal wave swelling in numbers and spilling farther and farther afield. These wild beasts, wrote the French monk Abbo, go through hills and fields, killing babies, children, young men, old men, fathers, sons, and mothers. They overthrow, they destroy, they ravage. Sinister cohort, fatal phalanx, cruel host. Sometimes the Vikings struck the same places again and again. The great Irish monastery of Armagh, chosen by St. Patrick as the seat of his church in the early 5th century, was to be plundered 5 times, 3 of them in 1 month in 832. The port of Dorestad on the Rhine, the biggest commercial center of northern Europe at the time, was robbed, wasted, depopulated at least 6 times according to one chronicler. No one knew where the Viking raiders would strike, or when, or in what numbers. Hamburg was sacked, Paris was burned. As fear and foreboding overcame the settled people of Europe, it seemed, wrote one monk, that all Christian people would perish. Such was the portrait of the Vikings drawn by the monks. Yet Vikings had another side, one that anxious monks could not see or appreciate, an enormously constructive and creative side. And in the long run, this was far more important than all the fire and fury of their raids and incursions. The Norsemen may have begun as raiders, but they developed into skilled conquerors and efficient administrators. They established long-lived states at the ends of Europe, east, west, and south. They taught the wild Slavic inhabitants of what is now Russia the rudiments of civil government. The Duchy of Normandy in northern France was a Viking creation that by the standards of the time was a model state, with a more tightly centralized government than anything the West had seen since the overthrow of Rome centuries before. The Vikings were brilliant tradesmen as well, canny, enterprising, risk-taking merchants, always on the lookout for new routes of commerce to open or old ones to revive. They brought fresh goods and fresh ideas into the society of the West and played a decisive role in spawning the new breed of feudal lords that would arise in the Middle Ages. Though they came from an almost wholly rural society with no more than a few towns in their land, they became town builders when the occasion demanded. Plundering the backward agricultural pastoral kingdoms of Ireland, they found it profitable to build a chain of market towns all around the coasts that became cities and provided the Irish for the first time with the stimulus and challenge of urban life. The Vikings were footloose and adventurous and as brave as lions, all qualities that fitted them admirably to serve as mercenary soldiers for foreign rulers. When the ruler was brave himself and generous, they fought for him to the death. Vikings formed the private bodyguard of the Roman emperors of Byzantium and helped the doomed but dazzling realm to survive for another half-millennium. All this the Vikings could accomplish because they were the most mobile people of their age, masters of those greatest of high roads, the seas and rivers and lakes. The Viking genius was born of the water. They were never more at home than when scuttling across distant courses in the ships they had built with vast thought and craftsman care, the fastest and finest vessels the world had ever known. At their most daring, they took these superb ships out across the western oceans into waters where, so far as they knew, no man had ever sailed. And when they found empty lands in the northern waters, they turned into tenacious colonists. In desolate Iceland, they built the first republic of modern Europe. And then they ventured far beyond to become the first Europeans to set foot on the great ice-capped mass of Greenland, and on the more inviting shores of North America. Much about these lusty, feisty, inquisitive, wide-ranging adventurers remains a mystery, including the very name by which they are known. No one is quite sure where the word Viking came from, or what it originally meant, Various etymologists have traced it back to a few Old Norse words from Vik, meaning inlet, because the Vikings' Scandinavian homeland was filled with fjords. Some claim it comes from the word vig, meaning battle, because they were so skilled in making wars. Others from vikja, meaning to turn aside or to deviate, a comment on their wiles and wanderings. Whatever its origin, the word quickly acquired for the peoples of Europe a meaning that it has really never lost. A seaborne rover, raider, conqueror, full of courage, guile, and brute strength. It meant much the same to the Vikings themselves. When a Norseman said he was going a Viking, as bold and ambitious men in the Scandinavian lands dreamed of doing throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, he meant that he would outfit a ship to sail over the high seas in search of plunder and adventure. Both of these, as far as the Vikings were concerned, were eminently respectable goals. Yet there was always an ambiguity about the term. Vikings were just as likely for one reason or another to turn their prows against their own neighbors as against distant foreigners. And when they did, those who had been harmed would scour the seas to punish them. Once a band of Vikings settled down and made a territory their own. They did not like being preyed upon any better than anyone else did. As witness Earl Magnus, a Viking born in the Orkney Islands, who was commended in a saga as being severe and unsparing towards robbers and sea raiders. The origin of the name Viking is only the first of the puzzles associated with these Norsemen. Virtually everything that is known about them comes from obscure and incomplete ancient sources, and from modern archaeology, which has only begun to piece together the history of these fascinating peoples. The most nearly contemporaneous of the written sources are the manuscripts of the clerics, such as those of Alcuin, Abbo, and Adam of Bremen. Their writings, combined with secular histories like the Anglo-Saxon and Russian chronicles, present hundreds of first-hand commentaries and reports. But at the same time, these records are likely to be biased, since they were written by the victims of the Vikings' depredations or by partisans of the victims. Other written accounts were left by acquaintances of the Vikings, such as the Arab merchants who encountered them in marketplaces around Scandinavia and continental Europe. But these proud Muslims were not much more favorably disposed towards the Vikings than they were Christian monks. Coming from an infinitely more settled civilization, they looked upon the Vikings as crude and uncouth. The Vikings themselves, alas, kept neither logs at sea nor annals ashore. Until the 11th century, they wrote scarcely anything save runic inscriptions on grave and crossroad markers. The only surviving accounts in their own tongue are the sagas, the legends of their heroic age, which were transmitted orally from generation to generation and not written down till long after the Viking Age had ended. The sagas are, however, a treasure trove of information. They tell much about how the Vikings lived, loved, worshipped, waged war, hunted, traded, explored. And the picturesque names by which they knew their epic figures conjure up much about their character and their behavior. King Eric Bloodaxe and Thorfinn Skullsplitter, known for their prowess in battle. Unnen Treefoot, who had a leg cut off in a sea fight and stumped around on a wooden one thereafter. Olaf Peacock, who loved fine clothes. And Sigurd Sow, who, though he was a king, dressed in old clothes and was always rooting around in his fields like an ordinary dirt farmer. As might be expected with histories committed to paper centuries after the fact, the sagas are riddled with contradictions, ambiguities, and mystifying obscurities. The authors often tended to be brief and matter-of-fact about the most dramatic of happenings. Nevertheless, for all their shortcomings, the sagas remain the truest measure for reckoning the values the Vikings lived by and for viewing their heroes and villains through their own eyes. Moreover, the archaeology has confirmed some of what the sagas recount, as it has the events recorded in Christian chronicles. At the dawn of the 9th century, when they began their raids on coastal Britain, the Vikings who erupted out of Scandinavia were essentially a single people, then barely on the threshold of dividing into the three nations of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. They spoke the same language, Old Norse. They lived the same rugged life on isolated farmsteads, usually near a body of water. They worshipped the same pantheon of gods, and their bards sang the same songs to honor the same warrior ancestors. They were descended directly from the Germanic tribes that fanned out over continental Europe, between the 1st and 5th centuries AD and brought down the Roman Empire. But earlier ancestors of the Norsemen can be traced much further back, to 6000 BC. By that date, men and women were paddling in primitive craft among Denmark's 600 islands, into the deep and narrow fjords that cut from the sea through Norway's craggy mountains and over the thousands of lakes and rivers that lace Sweden. The people who had used these craft were nomads moving from one hunting ground to another. Presumably, they paddled offshore in pursuit of seal, porpoise, and whale. 2 millennia later, these nomads were joined by a new wave of migrants and settled down to plant farms and live in permanent dwellings. But still, the boat provided their major form of food, which was fish. By 1500 BC, they had loaded their craft with flint tools and Baltic amber. Some of it worked into jewelry, some of it raw, and were venturing out as far as Ireland and Britain to barter for gold, copper, and tin. No ocean-going vessels of that era have ever been found, but the goods, unquestionably Scandinavian, have been uncovered in British Isles. Paradoxically, the very seas and fjords that from time immemorial inspired the Scandinavians to build boats, thus making possible both travel and communication, simultaneously bred in them traits of separateness and regional pride. Living in isolated pockets of land, where they wrested living from an ungenerous earth that was rock-strewn and frequently frostbound, they developed proud independence and fierce loyalties to their communities. A Viking farmstead raised crops of oats, barley, rye, and cabbage to supplement the haul from the sea, and it raised flocks of geese and herds of cattle, goats, sheep, and pigs to provide both food and raw materials, horn, skin, feathers, and wool, for tools, for clothing, and for the boat that was certain to be among its goods and chattels. On the farmstead stood a large building that housed perhaps as many as a dozen people, including 2 or 3 slaves who labored as farmhands and general helpers. The house might be faced with timber, stone, or sod, depending on what materials were at hand. Indoors, benches lined the walls of the central hall. The central seat was often raised to form sort of a throne of honor, and it was flanked by 2 pillars that were more symbolic than functional. The sagas related that all of the indoor woodwork, and especially the high seat pillars, was heavily carved, frequently with geometric and floral designs, and occasionally with representations of a deity, such as the ever-popular Thor. In such a hall, presiding in his high seat and surrounded by his sons and followers, sat the bondi, the proprietor of the farm, a self-reliant, self-sufficient patriarch of sorts. A Viking community might have a cluster of such houses huddled together, village fashion, or it might have several scattered over a valley that reached from the waterside to the mountain boundary. In either case, the community was generally populated by a family or several families who were related down to 3rd cousins, even 4th cousins, people who shared a common great-great-great-grandfather. These extended families formed federations with other extended families that occupied neighboring territories. Such federations shared enterprises of hunting and fishing, defense and trade, and as the practice grew after the end of the 8th century, raiding into foreign lands. Each extended family had its chieftain, known as a jarl or earl, and in times of stress, natural leaders emerged from among the chieftains. Here and there, such a leader might be known as a konungur, Old Norse meaning literally man of noted origin, and related to the English word king. In the early Viking days, such a petty king was by no means a national monarch. He was merely the leading figure in his region, large or small. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden began to emerge only after the strongest of these petty kings had subdued and unified a number of lesser kings and jarls, often after long and bloody fighting. Not until the mid-870s, some 80 years after the raid on Lindisfarne, did Norway acquire an actual king in the person of Harald Fairhair. Denmark and Sweden lagged more than 100 years behind Norway, with Svein Forkbeard ascending in Denmark in 985, and Olaf Skautkonung coming to rule Sweden in 993. Even then, the boundaries of the 3 nations continued to shift far beyond the Middle Ages, and the position of the kings themselves depended upon the acceptance of their people, or their own strength and skill in forcing that acceptance. A Viking leader, whether a king leading an invasion or a jarl instigating a local brawl with another chieftain, was expected to be on the forefront of the fight, and to perform feats of strength beyond the capabilities of the other men. Bloodthirsty, great-hearted, Olaf Tryggvason, who ruled part of Norway at the close of the 10th century, was one of the most admired of the Viking kings, not least because, as the saga devoted to his life says, he could hurl 2 spears at once, one with each hand, and because he could leap over the gunwale of his great dragon-prowed ship and bound from oar to oar while his men were rowing. It was a rare occurrence in the early days for a ruler to succeed in passing his crown to a son, unless that son was prepared to fight fiercely for the right to retain it. The Vikings had no long-established closed aristocracy. The Bondis, who came up from the bulk of the population, recognized only force of will and arms, and as free men and warriors as well as farmers, no doubt many among them nurtured ambitions of becoming jarls or even kings. The dominant preoccupation in a Bondi's life was family. His first loyalty was to his relatives. His prime ambition was to increase the fortune and fame of his family. The first duty was to defend its honor against the greed and affronts of others. That honor might be challenged any time a quarrel broke out, over any pretext: the size of a dowry, the theft of a sheep, the rights to a stranded whale. Such a challenge demanded satisfaction. Thus, blood feuds were a part of the normal pattern of the Norseman's life. At any moment, relate the sagas, the daily round of farming, herding, fishing might be torn asunder. A single spark of violence might set off an endless round of duels, ambushes, pitched battles, killings, maimings, and burnings. These blood feuds were pursued with malignant intensity, as each fresh killing stoked the furnace of hate. One saga recounts a climactic end to a blood feud, in which Thord Andreason fell into the hands of his enemy, a jarl named Gizur. Andreason says to Gizur, "I would ask this of you, that you forgive me for whatever I have done against you." "That I will do," replied Gizur in the cold, dispassionate tone that has been his since the day his whole family had been massacred by Thord and his friends, "as soon as you are dead." Thord tried to break away, but was felled by an axe stroke in the back of the neck delivered by one of Gizur's followers. Anyone stood ready to help sustain a feud, even a king. Another saga tells how one day, at the court of King Magnus the Good, Asmund Grankelson, one of Magnus's men, looked down to the harbor and there saw his enemy, Herrick of Thjota, landing his ship. "I will pay Herrick for my father's murder," cried Asmund, brandishing his weapon, which was only a thin sort of hatchet. "Rather take this axe of mine," said the king to Asmund. "There are hard bones in the old fellow." And he gave him a thick one, with a handle like a club. Asmund took the king's axe without a word, went down and plunged it into Herrick's skull with such ferocity that the axe edge was bent by the blow. The Viking woman was bred to be mate to such a man. She had to be sturdy and self-reliant, for she might have to assume responsibility for the family and farm while her husband was away fighting or seafaring. As she was a stickler for family honor, understandably, for there was scarcely a Viking woman who had not seen a father or brother or husband carried home broken and bloody from a fight. Unlike the men, she did not bear arms and could not take out her grief and rage in physical violence. But she could do, and did, insist that the menfolk return her an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Another saga recounts how an Icelandic chieftain named Flosi made a rare effort to stop the killings between his family and that of a neighbor named Njal. Flosi had been willing to accept a payment of money in atonement for the murder of his niece's husband, Hoskuld. But this move to pacify the quarrel got him nowhere. His widowed niece, Hildegun, taunted him with being a coward, and threw at him the awful blood-clotted shirt in which her husband had been slain. She goaded Flosi into slaughtering Njal and his sons. The act, in turn, led Njal's son-in-law to take threefold vengeance on Flosi and his family and friends. There seemed to be no way to end such feuds. They went on and on in perpetuity, or until one clan was utterly wiped out. The sagas make so much of the incessant feuding and bloodletting that it was a wonder the Vikings had any energy left to work their farms, to say nothing of joining forces for a raid abroad. Possibly the ancient storytellers gave an exaggerated idea of the extent of the feuds, though they were surely a large factor in Viking life. In any case, death held no terrors for the Viking warrior. If he fought with valor, he could expect to be summoned by the god Odin to join his fellow heroes in the golden celestial realm of Asgard and live in the great hall of Valhalla, where a man could feast and fight forevermore.